we say their tombs, and Google might say their tombs, and the mainstream guys might say their tombs, but there's very, very little evidence that they're tombs. Almost none, in fact. No bodies have ever been found in them. There's no glyphs in the Great Pyramid, and nor in the other pyramids for that matter, the megalithic ones, that suggest that they're a tomb, that kings' names aren't on them. We know what Old Kingdom tombs look like. There are Old Kingdom tombs at the Giza Plateau, covered in glyphs, covered in edifices and things like that. There's no evidence that they're tombs. It's so strange that that's the prevailing theory when there's just no evidence for it.
Welcome back to the Medicine Podcast. My name is Mimi, and I have my love, my king, my warrior here with me.
What is going on, everybody? Crazy excited today. This has been a long-awaited conversation. We are so stoked to introduce our friend, our fearless leader on our travels through Egypt. Probably my favorite Joe Rogan experience guest of all time, Mr. Ben Van Kerkwyk. Welcome to the Medicine Podcast, my friend.
Chase, Mimi, thanks so much for having me on. Yes, it's I've been looking forward to this for a while, and you guys, it was just a great time hanging out with you guys in Egypt. Thanks so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. I think most everybody on that trip did. It was probably the best Egypt tour I've ever been on. That was a really fun one. It's always a magical place, but I think the group and the people on that trip made it something special. So yeah.
And that's saying something, because the group was not small. We had close to 50, 60 people.
Yeah, close to 60. Yeah,
60, and to have zero drama, zero, I don't know, negativity at all. Like, everyone there was just there to learn and have a good time and ask some crazy questions and learn from you. And it was awesome. Minus the mummy tummy.
And it's like
the
COVID and chronic diarrhea for 3 weeks was pretty interesting. But besides that, dude, it was such a trip of a lifetime.
It was epic.
Just incredible.
Yes.
Awesome. That's great. That's great. I very much appreciate hearing that as well. But yeah, there's invariably some people do get a touch of the old mummy tummy in Egypt. It's kind of hard to dodge. But yeah. I mean, that's the biggest group I've done. I was a little nervous about it because normally it's like half that size. But we had radios too, so that made a huge difference. I think just on the sites having the ability, you're not screaming at people. Everyone's got a radio, and we've got a couple transmitters, so it made it much more manageable. And like you said, the group dynamic was great. Everybody was into it. I mean, we had a really diverse bunch of people with us. I enjoyed I just enjoyed the hell out of that trip. It was a good time, and we got into some places that, like, frankly, probably haven't been visited for decades. Like the Sphinx Temple in particular that place is really special. And our guide Yusuf, who literally lives across from the Sphinx and is born and raised there, and he's hang out with his dad, who was one of the first guides to show people around in Egypt, and he'd never been in there in his whole life. He's about my age, in his early 40s, and so just the opportunity to get into that place, that was something special for me. So that'll always stand out.
Yeah. That last day was just absolutely amazing. Like, I mean, we've had a host of different spiritual experiences in life, you could say, and that day, and then to really kind of cap the whole trip off with 2 hours in the Great Pyramid in the evening under I forget what planet was completely lit up that night, but it was like a beautiful night sky, and we're alone in the king's chamber for like an hour. I
think it was Jupiter.
Yeah.
Maybe
just might have been
Pluto.
Something like that. So it was Jupiter, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was so wild and so paradigm shifting, and it was the perfect experience for how we, Egypt has been on our bucket list for a long time, but there's no way that you can have that kind of experience just a couple of people going to Egypt. There was no way we were going to have, even if we would have hired a great guide. Like, you guys were able to get us into places, like you said, that haven't been visited in decades, which was we did not take lightly.
Yeah. Well, no, neither do I. I mean, that's the benefit of doing it like that as well. And you're right. It is. You can get sort of. There's definitely some pushy vendors and people that, it's tourism's a big part of the livelihood for a lot of people there, and they're potentially maybe a little more aggressive on pursuing a sale than in some other spots. But doing it in a group like that, and obviously our guys like Mo and the team that run it, I think they're the best in the business for that type of stuff. They really look after people, and ultimately their main goal is to make sure everybody has a good time in Egypt and just comes out with a positive experience. And that's the funny thing about Egypt. Like you can sit back and study it, and many people do for a lifetime. And it's this analytical process of maybe looking at the architecture and the details of the civilization. But then when you go there, you talk about spiritual experiences. There's absolutely something else that happened. Like it's an emotional connection. The first time I went there, the way I work, it's logical. I focus on the engineering stuff a lot. So I had all these expectations, but when you go there, it's like the whole other side of your brain connects to this. It's like this emotional experience that takes you somewhere with it. And those two things kind of meld together. That's why it's so special. And it's also why so many people find themselves being called back there again and again.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just takes you, in a lot of ways, takes you out of your own world. It gives you something else to think about. You're sort of in a different place for a while, and it makes your brain work a little bit differently when you're there.
Mm-hmm.
It's great.
Absolutely. It's a psychedelic experience just to be there. It completely changes the default mode of thinking just by sitting in it and absorbing that gnosis feeling of like, wow, there is something outside the three-dimensional world that I exist in that's going on here, and I'm kind of thirsty to figure out what it is. Of course, we went there with maybe 100 questions and came back with 1,000.
That's what happens.
And our very casual, Joe Rogan listening, Graham Hancock reading, very, very casual amateur perspective on history and archaeology and anthropology. Just our brains were freaking blown wide open while we were over there. But hopefully we can get into it a little bit today.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great segue to jump into, hopefully blowing some of our listeners and watchers' minds as well. But before we get into more of Egypt, the first question that we ask every guest on The Medicine is, what do you love in your life? What aspect of your life do you love so much that you wish you could gift it to every human?
That's relatively easy. I think it's independence. For me, it's the independence and purpose, I guess, would be the two things. It's we go through life, and our society's structured such that you follow the certain path. It's kind of a little bit of the conditioning of the world we're in, and it's a good life. Modern times are a great time to be alive. No doubt, I'd rather be alive in these times more so than anything else. But for me personally, it's finding eventually like a calling and a purpose that then you can combine that, and I guess to make it a livelihood and actually integrate that into what you do most of every day. And along with that, for me at least, doing what I do with YouTube and just this whole UnchartedX thing is that independence. It's just maybe I'm much more temperamentally suited to that. I was never a good one to sort of have a boss or being told what to do. So and I got away with it in a long time, but I was for 20 years in a structured corporate environment in IT. With a job that I enjoyed and a field that I still enjoy. But yeah, having that, like that, it was an absolute, and to this day, I still feel really blessed and lucky and privileged. And I would give up, it's not like if I want tons of money, I can go back to IT and things like that. And I'm more than happy to sacrifice that aspect of life for that ability to be independent, to be in charge of my own destiny, and to be lucky enough to be doing something that, for me at least, is a purpose. Like I feel like I've got a purpose in life, and I'm doing something, not just doing a job that's a means to an end. It's something that I'm very much passionate about, I'm engaged in, and I get to do it all the time now. And I'm just absolutely blessed by that. And if I could give that sense to people, that would 100% be it.
Well, that would, if every human had that in our world, like our world would change overnight.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that's what a lot of people are missing, is a overarching dream or mission or purpose in life, and a labor of love is what you have and what we have. And we actually get that answer quite a bit from entrepreneurs is freedom, independence. And yeah, you might have to sacrifice a little bit on the monetary end, maybe, but sometimes you're actually increasing, you're becoming more abundant, but
yeah, there's strings attached to the money that comes with the hamster wheel.
Yeah. Well, some people, that's true, but some people, it doesn't always have to be an income thing either. Some people find that purpose through, it might be family, or it might be other other angles, hobbies, things like that too. But yeah, if you can combine that with the ability to like make a livelihood out of it, and as you say, maybe in some cases with entrepreneurs, they're making way more money out of it, which is great. Then I think it's a good combination to have. When you can combine like I guess the job and the livelihood with that thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're very grateful for your purpose and your work in this life, because
Yes.
we're benefiting from it, and our listeners and watchers are benefiting from it as well.
Yeah. And so maybe that makes a good segue into like backing up a little bit, like, what do you do currently in the world today? And this YouTube phenomenon that you've jumped into and really just captured a beautiful corner of that space. And then how did you get there? Like, I would imagine it took a relatively large leap of faith to go from that corporate background into this realm of YouTube creation and content creation.
Yeah, it did. Well, and so, I do run, that's what I do now. I mean, I found myself on YouTube. I guess I'm a YouTuber, a content creator. I run the UnchartedX YouTube channel, unchartedx.com. I have a website and all the socials and all that stuff that's attached to it. And apparently it's what all the kids want to be these days. The latest surveys, it's, they used to say, well, it used to be back in the day, it was like, we want to be what our dad is, a fireman, policeman, whatever it is. And then it sort of shifted to, well, I want to be a celebrity. I want to be famous. And now it's a quite common response is, I want to be a YouTuber. You want to be that. And it's a lot of work. It's a grind. As you said, it was a big leap of faith. It took several years. But the way I got into this, I was always interested. My mother was a history teacher. So I always had an interest in history. I read the books. I remember going to university, but I was at the same time always into computers and IT and all that stuff. I was building computers in a computer shop when I was 15 and things. And went to university and went, well, I can either choose to make some money or I can go into this academic field. And I went the way of IT, which was great. But I had a long sort of 20-year career in IT. I moved all around the world. I was in Australia and pre-Y2K, the big boom in IT that happened as a part of that. Then I moved to Singapore and moved to the States. I've been in the US now for 17 odd years. But, it wasn't, and we were talking about this briefly earlier, it wasn't until, and I'd read Graham Hancock's, I think, Fingerprints, and I knew who he was, and I was interested in that, but it wasn't until his first appearance on Rogan's podcast. And I got to say, this must have been back 2012, 2011, maybe, back in the early days of that show, that he came on as this just mind-blowing conversation for me. And it was, funnily enough, not actually the historical angle to it. It was more that his work into consciousness and psychedelics. And that sort of, I hadn't ever thought about that stuff. Like, I just, I just wasn't into that type of thing. I was very much in the lane of consumerism and sort of climbing that corporate ladder and being successful. And I was good at my job and all of that. But that shifted, then that led me down the path of, well, I'm going to have some of these experiences myself. And then over a period of a couple of years, obviously, as you guys probably well know, it can shift your priorities, change the way you look at the world, the people around you, what you're doing with your time, who you are. And it had that effect on me. So I was sort of followed Graham a bit more closely at the same time this is going on. And then I heard, he put out a tweet saying, hey, I'm going to Peru and Bolivia to do some research for his new book. And the book he was working on was Magicians of the Gods, which was the follow-on to Fingerprints. And I was like, shut up and take my money. He had a little tour going on. And so in 2013, I went down and 2 weeks in Peru and Bolivia with Graham. Brian Forrester actually was running that tour, so I met him on that trip. And I was blown away that was fantastic, just being in that world. It's a similar experience to Egypt. The megalithic stuff down there is amazing. It's one of my favorite places. Peru's just a wonderful place. So is Bolivia. And then 2015 was really, he did the same thing in Egypt, which was, it was something of a notorious trip that there was supposed to be set up as a debate between him and Zahi Hawass at the end of this tour. And it's in the light of kind of the controversy and the things that are being said about his Ancient Apocalypse series. This is something that's been going on for a long time, but the debate didn't go well. Zahi had this big kind of dummy spit moment that was captured on camera, and it's on the internet. You can go and look at it. But
can you explain who he is?
Sure. So Zahi Hawass he's the Egyptian archaeology. If you think of like an Egyptian archaeology, you've probably seen pictures of him. He was a National Geographic ambassador for many years. Wears the Indiana Jones style hat and the blue shirt. He does lots of documentaries. He's probably the most famous archaeologist in the world. He's now semi-retired. And he's written a bunch of books, but he was in charge of the Supreme Council of Antiquities for many years. So controlling access to and all the digs and everything that happens around antiquities in Egypt. Very powerful figure, and very much a staunch defender of the orthodox sort of mainstream story of history. Notorious for calling people pyramidiates and attacking authors. Wasn't always the case. I've actually got a photo him arm in arm with guys like Graham Hancock, Robert Bovell, John Anthony West, all of these authors that are in Graham's field that you might consider them alternative. They've been proposing sort of alternative takes on history and alternative interpretations of the evidence for a long time. But anyway, that tour was a real eye-opening experience to the nature of a lot of the dogma that comes back from the mainstream. But it was on that tour where I was like, you know what, there's a big opportunity. Like there's a need for some, what I thought of at the time was like, at that time in YouTube, you couldn't go and find good footage of Egyptian sites. If you wanted to look at like Giza Plateau in detail or Abu Sir or any of these lesser known places that are remarkable, they're full of all sorts of interesting things, you couldn't really find it. There was a few documentaries floating out there, but they're lower quality than VHS tapes and stuff like this. And at the same time, you kind of had the rise of consumer grade 4K video equipment that's stabilized. And I thought, well, I think there's room here for a fresh look at a lot of these sites with the high quality video equipment that is combined with these concepts and ideas and these other takes on history that are buried in these books. So the only people that really know them, the people that are into the topic, they're reading these books. And I got into it with the intent of like, we'll make a documentary, but it's like, what the hell do I know about making documentaries? That's the film world. Like, you raise money and produce all this stuff, nothing. So you end up on YouTube, and that's where it went. But it wasn't until like the next year where I was like, well, I'm so interested in this and I'm so engaged by this. And I was taking time off from work to go travel and film and all this stuff. And I said, and I was lucky enough to be in a position where I was like, I can quit. I was getting lots of job offers and I would have had no problem finding work. So I essentially quit my job and thought, oh, well, I'm going to put my back into this for a couple of years. And that was 2015, 2016. And I'm still at it now. So that's how I ended up there. It took a couple of years. I mean, I almost went back to work, I think around 2018. I was looking at contract work, but then, the growth started to become more sustainable and it's taken off kind of from there. So yeah, I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for the support I get from my audience. And I'm glad that people enjoy the work I'm trying to share, because ultimately mostly I'm trying to satisfy myself with what I'm doing and my own curiosity. But yeah, I'm really grateful that people like it and get into it. Even if it is, as you said, something of a niche, like it's not, I need to get better at the broader appeal side of things, but it's a niche and it's a happy one for me.
It is, but it's something that's deeply resonating for many. Yeah. And there's something behind this work, the mystery of it, the feeling that there's more out there. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that resonates with a lot of people. Like, we're not looking at everything. And I think most people would honestly say that in their life that there is something kind of behind the veil. And I think this is just a really cool way to lean into that feeling that so many of us have. And I'm same with you, man. Like those early Rogan episodes, it was like Aubrey Marcus talking about ayahuasca. It was Graham Hancock talking about ayahuasca. Yep. I'm a Christian, school kid growing up. Like, what the hell is this? And I mean, I'm sitting in college like, man, my life is boring as hell. There is way more goods out there that I need to look into. And it totally pivoted my career out of corporate finance and moving into health and wellness and adaptogens and even the kind of original space of our podcast has been around, mushrooms and mind expanding ideas. And so I totally get it there. It just takes a little nudge.
It does. Yeah. And I think that you're right in that I think people crave to some extent that a sense of mystery. And I think when you look closely at a lot of aspects of where we are in our place on the planet, and there is something that seems to suggest another side of the veil, if you like. And I think certainly in this case, I think we do have a longer history on the planet. There's been some really remarkable scientific advances that have happened in the last 20 years that really should be affecting that story of our history as a species and as a civilization. In particular, the big one was the discovery of the cataclysm that happened. So we had this god awful, just catastrophe that occurred about 13,000 years ago. It's known as the Younger Dryas period. It's the transition from the from the Pleistocene, kind of the glacial maximum, into the Holocene, which is the era we're in today, about 13,000 years ago. And there's an extinction event associated with it, right? All the mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and anteaters the size of Volkswagens and giant ground sloths and stuff. A huge number of species went extinct in that period. And it often gets, I think some people maybe mix it up with the dinosaurs, but this was a very recent extinction event. And us humans as a species went through it as well, and it knocked us around, and it for sure would have eradicated any civilization that was around at that point. And I think that's a huge piece of this puzzle, because when you start to look at places like Egypt and South America, there's all this tremendous evidence that something else was going on in the deepest layers of those civilizations, almost like they started with all this stuff, and then they grew up on top of that, and thousands of years of building on top of it. And all of these other vectors that come from modern science and the work we've been doing are really reinforcing that story, that perspective on history. And unfortunately, it faces a lot of resistance from, I guess, what you'd call the mainstream academia, the archaeologists, the guys in those academic institutions that write the textbooks. And you see a lot of this in the pushback on guys like Graham Hancock and his recent Netflix series. But it's fantastic that there are guys like Joe Rogan who are interested in it, that give voice to some of these alternative theories. But I honestly think the weight of evidence now is really shifting, and it is time that we reevaluated those earliest parts of our history, because I think we do go back a lot further, and there's a much more interesting past to our species. And kind of the important thing about all that for me is that we typically kind of think it's this, I call it like a pillar or a tenet of being a modern human being. It's a pillar of our existence, this idea that we came from the Stone Age, we were cavemen, and we went up this ramp to civilization, more or less 6,000-7,000 years ago. And now we find ourselves here in the modern world doing our thing. And that's like the only time that's happened. That's the way it's supposed to happen, like it's some preordained path. And I think in reality, it's more cyclical. Like we've risen to heights in the past, and we've been struck down by cataclysm and external threats to the planet. And I do think that if more people understood that at a very fundamental level, this idea that, we're not the first, this isn't the first time we've risen to advanced civilization. And for sure, it's, those sort of cataclysms can and will happen again on a long enough time frame. That type of an understanding that's at a fundamental level across humanity, it might actually help to change some of our priorities and the way that we behave as a species, right? You might spend a little less money on tanks and a little bit more money exploring the stars and trying to get out there and spread out.
Right.
It's altruistic, but I think that's one of the important elements of trying to reevaluate our past.
Yeah, definitely. So let's start unpacking this a little bit. I think most people are tracking in the sense they're like, pyramids. These pyramids are completely crazy technologies that in no way, shape, or form just popped up out of nowhere. There has to be some sort of grandfathered, systematized, beautiful way of curating these things. Tough to imagine somebody just chiseling their way through the build of something of this magnitude. But it's so much more than that. And like what we looked through in Egypt, through a lot of what your work showcases, maybe we can start talking and beginning with the pyramids, and then
sure.
Some of the other lanes and areas that you've seen are clearly indicative of this, at least reason for us to take another look.
Sure. Yeah, and then pyramids are a good place to start, actually. So we kind of touched briefly on the other vectors. Like there's the Younger Dryas, there's the scientific work, there's the extension of the human timeline, there's no end of cultural indicators in origin stories around the world of cataclysm. So there's all these other vectors that affect it. But when you come and look at the specific ancient civilizations like Egypt, and there are others as well, there are a lot of these contradictions to the kind of the timeline, that what we would consider the mainstream timeline.
Yeah. So let's go through the mainstream timeline. Yeah. Let's iron that out.
Yeah. I can share some of this stuff too, if you like, maybe.
Yeah.
Let me grab that.
While you're doing that, just for reference for the listeners, if you were to Google some of these questions, how old are the pyramids, or who built the pyramids, or what were the pyramids used for, you would get sort of a cookie cutter answer. And when we were in Egypt, we had a stint about 4 days or so on a cruise ship, and Ben was awesome enough to present to us this, I think it was like 90 minutes of all this evidence that points to answers that do not exist on Google yet, right? But the evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just like theories that somebody thought up in their head. It was like, no, there's hard physical evidence, and we can use deductive reasoning to move through this. And I'm just going to toot your horn here a little bit. After this presentation, I mean, I was wide-eyed, like, oh my God, like tracking every single word with COVID, by the way.
Right.
But afterwards, I remember asking you, like, how do I share this presentation with every single person I know? Because it's that like mind blowing. So
Thank you.
just wanted to toot your horn a little
Thank
bit.
you.
And this is kind of where this topic, this episode is coming from, is because it was so freaking mind blowing, all the evidence that you've accumulated.
Thank you. I appreciate the compliment. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that presentation, and I will release that presentation as well. I'm going to do a version of it. I'm speaking just at the Cosmic Summit, which is coming up in June this year. Big summit. We're combining sort of like I'm speaking, Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, a lot of people that are involved in this space, authors and independent researchers, but also a bunch of credentialed and peer-reviewed scientists, people from the Cosmic Research Group, past presidents of the American Archaeological Society, a lot of people like that. It's going to be a great conference, and I'm giving a version of this presentation then. And after that, I'll definitely release a version of this, probably a longer one, online and have a video that steps through it. But yeah, it does walk through a lot of those details. And as you say, probably the best place to start is the pyramids. Let me share a couple things here. And you guys let me know if you can see it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So one of the things and I guess we can maybe just do a quick overview of Egypt in general. The timeline is a good one to kind of just to initially like set the stage for when you're looking at Egypt. Like, what are we talking about? Well, the civilization as we know it, you would call this the dynastic Egyptian civilization. This is the orthodox history, the version of history that is very much accepted and mainstream. But it generally begins more than 5,000 years ago, around 3150 BC, with Menes, who was the first pharaoh of the first dynasty, and that led into what you would call the early period in the Old Kingdom. You have these kingdoms or periods of Egyptian civilization that are separated by what you'd call like intermediate periods, or essentially downturn periods. It's when the upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt were potentially split. There was maybe war and strife going on, so we kind of separate these periods. But the civilization stretches for over 3,000 years in general. You have the Old Kingdom, you have the Middle Kingdom, you've got the New Kingdom. And then what's generally considered the late period, or the Ptolemaic period, which is where you have Greeks and Romans really being heavily involved in the Egyptian civilization. And in fact, Cleopatra, I'm sure everybody's familiar with, she was the very last ruler or pharaoh, I guess, of the Egyptian civilization. And when she committed suicide in around 30 BC, that's kind of the end of it. So that timeline stretches for a long time. It's 3,000 years. And when you get into things like the pyramids, what's interesting is that objects like the pyramids, and in fact this applies to a lot of what you might call the advanced artifacts, the ones that display elements of advanced engineering or technology, they all seem to come from the very earliest periods of Egypt. So for example, when we look at the pyramids, and you sort of zoom in on that part of the Old Kingdom, we're way back over here with 2700 BC, the very earliest parts of the civilization in the Old Kingdom, dynasties 3 through 6. That's where all of these pyramids, the big, massive ones that are still standing today, that's where they come from. And the whole timeline of pyramid building is a massive contradiction in the story of history to me, because we start with what people say is like the very first, the proto-pyramid, which is the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. That's this one here on the left. But almost immediately after that, you have what, and this is the mainstream timeline. You immediately go into these giant megalithic precision built pyramids. This is the mainstream timeline, and it's just you jump from something relatively primitive to these massive edifices that are made up. So, for example, the Great Pyramids, like it's something like, what is it, like between 5 and 6 million tons and 2.5 million blocks of stone. Still standing today, was the tallest man-made object on the planet up until the Eiffel Tower was built. It's still one of the most precisely made structures in terms of its alignment to true north that we've ever made. We didn't even develop the capability in our civilization to measure that degree of accuracy of how well it was aligned until the 1700s. And there's all these remarkable elements to it that we can talk about. But that's like they say that's the fourth pyramid ever built. And then you have, in a very short period of time, on the Giza plateau, you have the 3 massive pyramids up there. You're talking about those all being supposedly built in a period something around 50 to 60 years. So it's all of this stuff's packed into the very earliest part of the civilization. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
I was just going to give some context for the listeners. You mentioned, I think it's 2.3 million stones or 2.5 million stones make up the Great Pyramid. These aren't just like rocks or bricks. These are stones that are taller than me in some cases, and right. the granite, which I'm sure you'll get into, but I just want to kind of stamp this here so people understand. It would be, just using logical reason, impossible for humans as we know them to be able to move 2.3 million stones from 500 miles away where the quarry was to the site at Giza, right? So it's not just right. They're picking up stones from 5 feet away and placing them. It's a
combination of things. Yeah, it's a combination of so the outer casing stone, like most of the stones in the pyramid, you're right, they're quarried stones. They weigh an average of between 2 and 3 tons. They're big blocks on the Great Pyramid. Some of the other pyramids have much larger stones, but the interior structure of the Great Pyramid is made from granite. And now that granite and some of these blocks of granite, these ashlars, are like 70 to 80 tons, single pieces. They've come from a quarry in Aswan that, yes, it's 500 miles away. So that, we know that's where the source for the granite was. There's nothing around that Giza area that suggests they could get any granite. All of the quarries, we know the quarries are there. You can go and visit them. That's where a lot of that granite came from. Now, it's not just a matter of, there's a huge logistical problem around the pyramid in general, and maybe we can just look a little bit more closely at that. For example, here's an image of the middle pyramid and some of the limestone blocks on the exterior. You can see the size of some of them.
They're not just bricks.
No, they're not just bricks. And there's a couple of elements to it that they're very precisely made. It's an extremely challenging task, and there's a logistical train of thought that you can go back. So with the Great Pyramid, the guy, the ruler who supposedly built it, his name is Khufu or Cheops, if you like it Greek. He reigned for around 25 years. So 20 to 25 years is the estimation that they say it took. That's about the time they say it took to build. Now, if you work backwards from that and you look at the number of blocks that are involved, you're talking across 25 years, you have to have one block finished, cut, transported, put in place, perfectly aligned, all of that, one block every 5 minutes for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 25 years in order to build that structure in 25 years. Now, that doesn't take into account the tremendous amount of foundational work that has to go into these structures. Like Yusuf and I, we go to great pains to show people when you're walking around the pyramid, the tendency is to look up at this thing and go, man, that thing's amazing. But what you should also is look down at your feet, because at the feet there was probably years and years of work in terms of leveling the ground. In some places they put in these gigantic floor tiles that are the foundation blocks for the pyramid. Some of these weigh in excess of 200 tons. They're fit together with precision. It's like a 3-dimensional block that locks into the bedrock, and the other blocks around them, you can't fit a razor blade in between the gaps, which is something you see on pretty much all of this pyramid architecture, which is just utterly remarkable. It doesn't, that figure of one block every 5 minutes doesn't account for all of the other structures that are associated with the pyramid complex, because pyramids aren't really there on their own. They have a complex of other structures around them. They have causeways and so-called temples, but these are other, giant megalithic structures. So it's very implausible that this type of thing can happen in 25 years just on its own, under any circumstances, let alone what you would consider the very primitive Bronze Age technology of the time, which, let's remember, in the Old Kingdom, no pulleys, no wheels, no iron, no cranes, no use of no animals. There's no indication that animals were used with the dynastic Egyptians. They used ropes, they used levers, they used wooden sleds, and they used human horsepower. And it was only a 3-month period of the year when the Nile floods, like this yearly inundation, like that was the only time of the year where you had enough water to be able to then ship these stones, 500 miles north to Giza from Aswan to get the blocks there. So the logistical challenges of this type of thing back up further and further. And it honestly gets even crazier when you look at some of the other examples. So before Khufu and the Great Pyramid, the three pyramids that preceded that were the pyramid at Maidum, the Bent Pyramid, which we visited, and also the Red Pyramid. We went into both those pyramids on our trip. Now, all three of these pyramids are associated to a guy named Sneferu of the Third Dynasty. This is, again, the mainstream story. Now, you've got to ask yourself, so if these pyramids were tombs, how come he needed three of them? How many giant pyramids does one pharaoh really need? Obviously, I don't think they're tombs. There's really no evidence to back up the fact that they were tombs. No, there's never been mummies found in these pyramids or anything like that. But if you try and cram these three giant pyramids, which each of them is almost as big as the Great Pyramid on their own, you're talking about, it's 3.5 million tons of stone, and it requires more than 380 tons being installed every single day over 25 years to get these three pyramids built. So it's, you have a logistical challenge here that's very, very, very significant, and you have a technological timeline challenge too, because what is interesting is that after this period, so after these megalithic massive pyramids were built, the Egyptians kept building pyramids, right? So not many people really may be aware of this, but they do keep building pyramids. But like this, for example, is the pyramid at Hawara, and you'll notice that it's not megalithic. It's not made out of stone. It's made out of mud bricks.
Yeah.
And so if you think of a technological timeline, like how do you start at the top of that? How do you peak instantly with your capability, your technology, and then you start building pyramids out of mud brick? And
it would be like the equivalent of us, having iPhones in all their capability with 4K cameras and everything back in the 80s. And now we have the huge bricks, that have a cord in your car. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So I just want to translate a little bit.
Yeah.
The technological gap, the timeline doesn't make sense because we're seeing the most advanced as the oldest. And
That's
as
right.
time goes on, we see the more primitive kind of copycat type of structures. It just doesn't make sense with how we know technology advances.
Yeah. It's great examples. It's like, we had iPhones and everything else back in the day, and now we're using these, corded rotary dial phones made out of Bakelite,
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it's the same thing. And I call it's a technological contradiction that exists in multiple categories of evidence across Egypt. It's not just pyramids. That's the interesting thing about it. So with the pyramids, you can see here on the left, you've got these older megalithic pyramids still standing today, amazing structures, wonders of the world. And then on the right, you've got examples of a number of these mud brick pyramids that are all collapsed and worn away. So you've got to, this is a question mark on the orthodox story of history. Now, maybe there's another interpretation of this evidence that better fits what we're seeing. And for me, that concept is one of inheritance and longer timelines. So, having embracing the idea that maybe there was some inheritance going on in dynastic Egypt, that these guys started with some artifacts, maybe some architecture. For sure, they worked on these pyramids. They, again, you've got to look at this through the lens of thousands of years of occupation of the dynastic civilization, then more thousands of years after that of quarrying and destruction and rebuilding, and other cultures coming in and doing their thing on the sites. These sites have been used as quarries, and they've been pillaged for stone for literally thousands of years. So you have to keep looking at it through that lens and understand what it is you're seeing. But this is a huge contradiction in the technological timeline. And it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't just exist in pyramids, but we see the same thing when it comes to some of the other granite objects and artifacts across Egypt. There's a whole category of different artifacts, columns, vases, bowls, statues. There's a number of these contradictions that really lean towards a longer timeline and the concept of inheritance. And the one thing that I do like to tell people is like, well, what do the Egyptians themselves say? Like, we've translated lots of hieroglyphs. We understand that's a science now. What do they say? Well, that's exactly the story they tell. The Egyptian civilization, and they viewed themselves as a legacy culture. Their history, their own history, as they see it, stretches back nearly 40,000 years. Like we today say, well, they started around 3000 BC and they went for about 3,000 years. They themselves run their history back 10 times as far. They have a list of kings and rulers that goes back nearly 40,000 years.
Yeah, and that was just a humbling experience to get to witness Yusuf explaining. I think it was the list of kings, or the king's list, or however that was articulated.
Yep.
Just the sheer record of how ancient this potentially could be, whether it's myth or metaphorical or not. The fact that there is some level of tracking that pertains to the history that's far exceeding what archaeology would suggest is mind-blowing.
Yeah, and there's multiple sources for this too. You have the Palermo stone, you have the there's a what's his name? There's a particular scribe, Manado, the scribe and priest Manado, who's referred to this story. Then you have the Turin Papyrus, what's known as the Turin Papyrus, that actually lists these out, and they go back to two separate periods. There's one period called Zep Tepi, which is essentially when the gods themselves walked the earth. Now, the capabilities in these timeframes and the things that they describe as happening to them could, they interpret it as magic, but you could also interpret it as technology. After that, they had the period of the Shemsu Hor, or the followers of Horus. Again, semi-divine mystical beings with all of these amazing powers that, again, a primitive Bronze Age civilization like the dynastic Egyptians, and I don't really think, I think that's exactly what they were. You would interpret that stuff as being magical. Like that's technology. Like magic is generally just technology we haven't understood yet. I mean, that's been the case throughout time. Mm-hmm. And there's so many other indicators when it comes to the pyramids that suggest that there was something far more complex going on deep in antiquity. There's a couple of good examples here I'd love to share. One of them is the fact that the Great Pyramid actually is a pretty accurate scale model of the northern hemisphere of the planet. Not only that, it encodes the actual dimensionality of planet Earth as we know it, and I'll explain how that happens. It's the Great Pyramid. You can kind of see its angle here. I think this is the what would this be? The west face. It sits on something called this socle, and I've highlighted this in blue here. So it's kind of like a little platform that the pyramid itself sits on. You can see the edge of the pyramid where the casing stones would have gone down, and you see this little platform that the pyramid is kind of sat on top of. It's around a cubit high, which is 55 centimeters, roughly an Egyptian cubit. Now, what this does is it gives you two methods for measuring the perimeter length of the pyramid. So if you were to measure the full perimeter length of the pyramid, you can either measure it around the base of the pyramid or around the socle, so the base of the socle. Turns out, when you measure those two numbers and you compare them, it actually matches the ratio of latitude and longitude on the planet. It's actually a reflection of the shape of the Earth, in that the Earth is an oblate spheroid, right? It means because we spin, we're not perfectly spherical. We're a little bit further around that east-west equator than we are around like the north-south equator. So if you were to measure that distance around the center of the planet, then the distance around the planet on the poles, it's a little bit longer east-west. So this is how we measure the Earth, right? This system of latitude and longitude. It means they're not square. So if you go down to 1/4 of 1 minute of latitude at the equator, you're a little bit a little bit shorter north to south than you are east to west, right? So 3,043.5 feet is 1/4 of 1 minute of longitude at the equator. Now that's 0.1 of a foot off the perimeter length of the pyramid with the socle. And then you're 0.2 of a foot off the latitude measurement when you measure the pyramid length of the pyramid without the socle. So the pyramid's essentially encoding the shape of the Earth in its dimensions. And it's not just a coincidence either. Like this ratio is very accurate.
Yeah.
It's so nuts.
And this is not an easy thing to figure out. Like we had to have satellites in space doing accurate surveys to really get down to this number. And because we had done math and we sort of calculated the equatorial length of the planet in the past. And it was funny because once we started to get into doing satellite measurements, our numbers came closer and closer to the measurements of the Great Pyramid. Like as we got more accurate, it got closer to the numbers of the Great Pyramid. That's not the only thing. Like this is far beyond this knowledge, far beyond the capabilities of what we know the dynastic Egyptians would have known about the planet. Not only that, but the Great Pyramid is essentially a scale replica or 1 to a 43,200th model of the northern hemisphere. So if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and you multiply that number by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. In other words, the distance from the center of the Earth to the top of the North Pole. If you multiply the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid by 43,200, you actually get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So there's a scale here that's involved with the Great Pyramid, and it's reflecting the dimensions of the planet. It's a remarkable degree of technology that seems to be encoded into this monument. 43,200 itself, this is a whole other discussion. If people want to get into it, I'd recommend following the work of Randall Carlson. I have a podcast with him where we get into the significance of numbers like 43,200 or 432 and 72. These are very significant numbers that show up time and time again through historical and cultural myths and legends that indicate that there is significant celestial knowledge being embedded in religious and origin stories from cultures all around the world. They show up again and again and again, even in cultures that really have had no capability of measuring these things. A lot of them have to do with cycles of the heavens, long-term cycles of the heaven, things like the precession of the equinox, which is a 26,000-year cycle that essentially it's the wobble of the planet, that it takes us 26,000 years to go through one cycle. These numbers relate they're very much involved with these types of measurements. And what it's indicating, and there are great books like Hamlet's Mill that go through this in excruciating detail, that it's indicating that this knowledge is embedded into cultures around the world, potentially from a common source, like a common ancestor. Again, all of this stuff points back to this idea that there was a civilization or a people in deep antiquity that had a very sophisticated understanding of the planet, of the motions of the heavens, and they had amazing technological capability to basically execute on those. And then that knowledge was eventually disseminated into modern cultures or modern ancient cultures, and then it comes down to us today. These references also exist in the Bible, for example. And it's if you consider that, how would you get through a civilization, or how would you pass down knowledge through things like a cataclysm, through like the younger Dryas, when your civilization is going to end, and maybe you knew it was coming. Like if you were looking at the stars and you saw that comet in the sky that was approaching, that would be the way to do it. You would embed these tales into oral stories and things that would be passed down in oral traditions through time. You might embed these elements and this data into architecture and into artifacts that you know are going to stand the test of time, things like giant stone pyramids. So it's really not until today's modern times where we've got enough knowledge, we understand the motions of the heavens, we can put this stuff together and we can research it and actually start to make the discoveries and go, maybe there are messages being passed down through time to us, through ancient cultures and through some of these artifacts and monuments that we can still observe. It's kind of remarkable when you get to it. So I think there's more and more evidence that points to it, this longer timeline, and the concept of a lost ancient civilization that was very advanced.
Yeah.
It's so clear just by like the sheer casual observer and that being us, just our gut instinct is suggesting this is so wildly impossible for the way that ancient Egypt and those cultures are articulated in the mainstream compared to these technologies. And it does take this level of awareness to be able to actually grasp that, because without the ability to understand, geometry, you kind of look at it and you go, damn, man, those fucking Israelites were just really putting it together. We're taught
putting the work in. Yeah.
Sunday school that the Israelites
slaves
built the freaking pyramids. But it's wild. It's almost like there was the ability to tap into some divine protractor that has sacred geometry embedded within it, and thus that intelligence, that divine intelligence that we had the capacity to interact with back, thousands and thousands of years ago was more available or accessible than definitely now. Maybe not available at all now, but it's so clearly evident that there is this other level of intelligence that was accessed, or technology that was accessed, that is something very foreign to us now.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, what I was thinking when you were talking about, now we have satellites and we have the ability to go around the earth and to measure and to get these measurements and make, look at these different ratios and things. It's almost like we're in our technological ego in 2023 or however, whenever we started doing this and picking up on this, because it seems like we're we've gotten a little too big for our britches, where we have the ability now to measure and to do these things with the amazing technology that we have. But it seems like we're still not answering or asking we're still not asking the right questions and all of the questions, which is, something that I love about all of this is like you're bringing up more questions rather than just what we've like stamped, like, okay, right, this is what we all, believe and we'll put into Google.
Yeah, you're right. And that is a lot of it. It does frustrate. I know it frustrates some people like, well, what's the answer? I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily the point right now, because one of the challenges, and we see this, I think, in a lot of the response from the mainstream to some of these topics, and certainly the way we view the past, the arrogance in this technological big for our boots. It's a great way of phrasing it, because we have a very strong tendency to look at the past and even the very sophisticated elements of the past and try to look at it through this lens of like, how would we solve this problem? Like what's out, because we're assuming that we're superior. Our technology, our culture, our civilization is superior to everything that's come before. So the answer must lie within how we would do it, how our technology would solve this problem. And I think the reality of the past, and looking at some of these elements and some of the stuff you were talking about, Chase, with them tapping into other realms of knowledge, I think that applies to technology as well. We know for sure that we will know more in a decade, in 100 years, in 1,000 years about any number of aspects of science. So therefore, there's plenty of science and technological areas we don't know about today. I think some of the answers and some of the ways this potential lost civilization may have functioned, those answers may lie in those realms that are outside of our current, set of understanding and outside of our capability. And I think we should be open-minded enough to go back and look with that in mind. And I think that's, honestly, it may actually lead to us even learning something, because there are for sure a number of real conundrums that we couldn't solve today, that we can't achieve. There's a few little different elements. I have a bunch of videos that get into those aspects, but it's like you sort of, Flinders Petrie and these guys that were first discovering them in the 1800s, late 1900s or early 1900s. They were scratching their head out, and honestly, even our best engineers and craftspeople and experts today are scratching their head out today, saying we don't know how this was done. So there's definitely, I think, there was something else going on, and it didn't look like us. Like the way that we've done it is not necessarily the same way that it happened in the past. And I do wish that more people would look at the past with more of an open-minded approach to that possibility.
Yeah, yeah. So clearly we're looking at the mainstream version of how human history has played out. Mm-hmm. And even just through assessing the pyramids alone, we're seeing some, contradictory evidence that may suggest something else happened. And I want to get into a little more of some of the other evidence that you've specifically accumulated and looked into, craftsmanship on a smaller scale, and even some of it not even that much of a smaller scale due to the magnitude of what actually is able to be put together, like in some of the sarcophagus and some of these other, just wildly amazing size and sheer volume that's been crafted in the way that it has. But before we do, maybe let's talk about, you mentioned a inherited technology or inherited history. So while we're at this kind of moment of, all right, mainstream doesn't quite make sense, at least through the lens of how advanced these pyramids were, what does make sense? You mentioned inheritance.
Yeah, so I think and again, there's multiple vectors that I think are suggesting this story. And technological, the timeline and the contradictions we mentioned are certainly one of them, but also these stories of cataclysm, and you can't find an ancient culture, ours included, and our Judeo-Christian religions have these same stories. Every single one of them almost talks about this idea that our ancestors were wiped out in some cataclysm, be it flood, fire, something else. And then, mankind was forced to start again. So, we're telling the story of longer timelines, and it gets, interpreted, and it's deified and all these other things as part of it. But it's a very consistent theme that exists from the Hopi Indians of North America to the Mahabharata of, Indian traditions, to the Bible, to the Nordic Elder Eddas, to Brazilian mythology, all over the world. Same story. I've got tons of examples we could get into. But yeah, the overall theme and the premise, and of guys like Graham Hancock and certainly me, I think the evidence supports this interpretation of the past, is that there was an advanced civilization, human civilization at some point. It was wiped out by cataclysm. It was gone. But small pockets of those people may have survived, and some knowledge, maybe even some artifacts and some capability was kept alive in small pockets, and then eventually that stuff may have been used to kickstart the civilization in places like Egypt. Now, you're inheriting. So if you're the dynastic civilization, you're inheriting some architecture. You might be inheriting thousands of artifacts, statues, vases, columns, sites, all these types of things, potentially architecture like pyramids, like, megalithic structures. Same thing in South America, although the timelines are different in South America. And I kind of look at dynastic Egypt as something of like a really advanced cargo cult. Cargo cults are like, there's examples of them in the modern world. You might have a lost tribe in the Amazon or something that, has an artifact, or they find a modern artifact, and they find it useful, but they can't use it in the way it's intended. It's like, if you ever watched back in the day, there's a movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy. You ever see that?
Mm-mm.
No.
Hilarious. So it's essentially a Coke bottle. A glass Coke bottle gets dropped out of a plane, and a lost tribe in Africa kind of uses it, and they find it really useful. They end up fighting about it, and one guy ends up having the story's about his journey to drop it off the edge of the world, which is like, a cliff edge off a mountain and things. But that's the concept of a cargo cult. And I think we're kind of looking at that with the dynastic Egyptians. Now, if you have some cultural memory of capability, so let's say these sites were functional, the pyramids did something, maybe they were energy generators. There's lots of theories and some very good ones that support that interpretation. I certainly think there was something functional going on with the boxes, the giant sarcophagus, what we would call sarcophaguses today. But as the dynastic Egyptians, you don't have the capability or the understanding to actually activate it, to use it that way. But you have some cultural memory of something like that happening. It's you end up trying to replicate that through ceremony, through through significance and making it religious, and you do it's like it becomes this ceremonial aspect of life. The modern analogy I'd give is like, well, if we went through a cataclysm today, say Younger Dryas happens tomorrow, and our civilization gets wiped out, we're all knocked back to being hunter-gatherers. Within a couple generations, you might have people standing around a campfire, carving a black rock to make it look like this, and dancing around the fire, hoping that they can turn it on, because these black rocks could give you the answer to everything. Every question you've ever had, you can talk to anyone in the world. You can look at the earth from anywhere in the world, Google Maps, whatever. Like
he's holding up his cell phone for the listeners. Yeah,
holding up a cell phone. That's right. So that's what we might do. We'd be sitting around campfires talking about cell phones and plasma TVs, like there was some mythological thing that existed that no longer does. And maybe we're trying to replicate them. So you definitely see that in Egypt. You have a whole category of artifacts and objects that are extremely advanced, that show incredible sophistication in their engineering, that require remarkable tools, that some stuff we would be challenged to make today. And I'll get into some specific examples of that in a minute. But you also have another category of artifacts that they're almost like imitations of those artifacts. And a lot of those came much later in the civilization. And those are explainable by the very primitive tools, the things like, copper chisels, pounding stones, flint chisels, primitive methodologies. You have this tale of two industries that is spread across all these categories of Egyptian artifacts. You've got sophisticated ones that don't match the tools and the techniques that we found in that civilization. And then you've got a whole category of artifacts that do. And they're often in the same dimension. So you have the one that I like to talk about is the granite vases, the bowls, the jars. You have an incredible array. And I'll share this as well, because this is worth seeing.
Yeah, it's like if
incredible.
you've ever bought like fake Jordan shoes from like China, they like pieces of shit when you get them and they're falling apart, but they're clearly close enough to the original.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a big technological gap between these. So the interesting thing about the vases, and you can go to the Egyptian Museum or the British Museum, there's a lot of these. They're all over the place. But there exists this category of artifacts that come from the very earliest times of ancient Egypt. And in a lot of cases, they come from what you'd call pre-dynastic times. We know that some of these vases stretch back as far as 15,000 years ago. They've been found in sites that are definitely pre-dynastic, basically Mesolithic times. And most of them then also were found in burials that are in the first, second, or third dynasty of ancient Egypt, and they tend to disappear after that, which is the interesting thing. And these are remarkable objects. It's not pottery. These aren't spun on a wheel. They're carved from some of the hardest types of stone known to man. Granite, diorite, corundum, schist, porphyry. It's an endless list of them. These are rock crystal. These are types of stone that are harder than steel. So that, if you measure the hardness of materials on the Mohs scale of hardness, steel's around a 6 to 6.5. Some of these types of stones are 7, 8s, and 9s on the Mohs scale. So very, very challenging material. Not only that, but it's not a consistent material. If you think of the way we carve precision objects today, we do it out of like steel, which is a very uniform material, right? The hardness doesn't vary. It's well made. These types of stones, you can see these crystal occlusions and these different color patterns. That means that the material itself is going from softer material to harder material in the stone matrix. So it might be going from mica or hornblende to quartz. And it's, so there's implications on how you carve them. Now, some of these vases are just absolutely remarkable. And they were found in great numbers. There was more than 40,000 of them found beneath what's called the step pyramid of Djoser. And we were lucky enough to go down there and actually go into these catacombs and tunnels. There's like 6 miles of tunnels beneath this pyramid. Nuts. And there are still fragments of them available down there. Here's a picture of one that I took when I was down there last time. And you can see the older photographs of the early excavations of this space where there were just thousands and thousands of these things discovered. And this is, again, 3rd dynasty, very early period of ancient Egypt. The funny thing about them is that even in the mainstream story, they don't suggest that these were made in the 3rd dynasty. There's a museum in Saqqara where this pyramid is, and on the wall there it tells you that they say most of these were likely inherited objects. They were from older times that were inherited. Now they say, well, it was 1st and 2nd dynasty, but I don't think they're going back far enough, because we do have examples of these objects that stretch back into those pre-dynastic times before the civilization even started. So Djoser, the pharaoh, probably collected them all. He's like, these are amazing. They're valuable. I want them buried with me. And he pulled them out of these tombs, and then he had them buried with him, and that's where we find them. And even the mainstream version of history says, well, he didn't have these made. These are clearly from earlier times. It's like, what earlier times? There's no evidence of that type of capability in those periods. In terms of their technological sophistication, some of them are remarkably thin. Like you're getting this type of stone down to this degree of thinness. Yeah. In fact, there's some examples that have been measured to be as thin as 1/40th of an inch. Very difficult. This type of stone becomes very brittle when it's like this. So carving this type of thing is a massive challenge. This is the well-known schist disc. This is made from schist. It's just an incredible form. One of the more notorious ancient artifacts was found in a 1st dynasty tomb. A lot of it is reconstructed from pieces, and then we've added sort of and formed it and put it back together. But this is making these sort of curves and getting this material, a brittle material like schist that's both very hard and brittle when thin, is an incredible challenge. Some of these vases display just absolutely perfect balance, symmetry.
It looks like that one's floating.
Yeah, it's so well made and so well balanced that it's like it's standing on almost on like the tip of an egg.
Yeah,
like it's just the bottom of this vase is just it's barely touching the ground here. Here's an example of the bottom of one of my favorite vases, and again made from a remarkably hard material. Now these things exist. Here's a rock crystal dish, I guess, but carving these ridges again. Very, very difficult. You can almost see the tool marks in it too, like the centering tool marks. We saw that in the early example. So there's tube. Again, this is not something that is really attributed to those early dynastic periods. And some of them range in size from very, very, very large to very small, like down to like a thumbnail size, and then other ones that you'd probably take 2 guys to lift. So there's a wide variety of these.
And I just wanted to point out something that, and maybe you're getting to this, and I apologize if you are, but something you mentioned on Rogan, and you certainly mentioned it when we were in Egypt. But if you're watching and seeing these vases, you can see that they're not like, it's not like a perfect circle. It's not even like uniformly shaped all the way around, and they have handles, which
they do
also increases the degree of difficulty, because if you think of something like spinning, which I know you just said it's not like pottery being spun where they're just like forming it with their hands.
Yep.
And the handles, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so here's a good example of this tiny little one here that's translucent. Yeah, so a lot of so you got to remember too that the funny thing is that the orthodox Egyptologists do not attribute the use of the lathe or the wheel to the Old Kingdom Egyptians. So they think that these were made with just by pounding stones and grinding, not spinning. Now there's undeniable evidence that they were turned, would be the term. So turned on a lathe where either you're spinning the tool or you're spinning the work. You actually have, and Petrie has done, Flinders Petrie is one of the early pioneering Egyptologists to explore this topic, as well as Chris Dunn, who's written several books on the topic. There's undeniable evidence that they were in fact turned. We see the tool marks on the insides of these vases. There's centering holes, there's centering marks, there's cusps that are left from when the vase was recentered. There's undeniable evidence that they were in fact turned. But as you say, if you're spinning, like for example, this vase down that vertical axis, you can't carve the handles that way. You would have to leave a ridge or a bullnose all the way around the vase and then come back with another tool and carve all that material away to shape the handle. So there's multiple steps involved in how these things were constructed. Or, perhaps if you go all the way with speculation, it may not have been a lathe. It might have been a 5-axis mill that carved it all in the first place. But and where I'll go with this is the fact that we've recently, for the first time ever, actually measured one of these vases, put it under a structured light scanner, and measured it down to the thousandths of an inch in terms of looking at its precision. And the results are truly profound. Like these were measured by professional metrologists. Metrology is the study of measurement, and the geometry of that vase and the relative surfaces, their precision relative to each other, are literally in the thousandths of an inch. And this is not something that is even close to ever being repeatable or achievable by hand. Yeah, it's suggestive that these things were made by some form of machine. You've got a couple problems to overcome when you're trying to carve objects like this. One is how you're carving this material. Like, it's harder than steel. You've got to have something that's harder, that's able to deal with the going from soft to hard material. And then you've got to have something guiding that tool that is so precise that it can maintain geometry and geometric precision down to a thousandths of an inch. Now, to give you some context, the width of a human hair is between 2 and 3 thousandths of an inch. So you're talking about precision that's half the width of a human hair.
Oh my gosh.
And that's literally incontrovertible, undeniable data that we've just found. I just put a video out about this. It's generated a fair bit of angst amongst Egyptologists. And I'm sorry for the light coming in here, by the way. It's that time of day here, just lit up by the sun. But yeah, that's what we're finding with these vases. We actually scanned a pre-dynastic vase, one that was around and was created for sure before the dynastic Egyptian ever started. When, we don't know, but it was found in a pre-dynastic burial. And so the interesting thing is there's a whole bunch of other aspects to these vases. This, for example, is a pre-dynastic granite vase. The blue one on the right. It's not granite. It's another very hard type of stone. You would often find these in burials next to very simple pottery. Now, this other vase that's next to it is pottery. It's made with clay. It's not even turned on a pottery wheel. It's made by hand. It's really simple. And they've even painted it to look like granite. They've added the dots to it to make it look like granite. This is clear imitation. We're talking about like imitating a cell phone around a campfire.
Yep.
That's exactly what we're seeing here with these vases. Like, whoever was making vases in pottery, if you found one of these hard stone vases, you would be astounded by it. You would know immediately how valuable it was and how significant it was. So you start to imitate it. And we see this time and time again. We have so many of these out-of-place artifacts that go way back into time, and they're displayed in cabinets next to bone and beads, these primitive artifacts. Here's a good example. One of my favorite things in the museum. It's a tube of lapis lazuli. It's hollowed out. It's perfectly made. And it's got a gold sheath on it, and it's just labeled pre-dynastic. And you can see the bone artifacts and the beads next to it. It's an out-of-place artifact. It's something that's technologically sophisticated, well beyond the capabilities of anyone who's using bones and beads to make. But because it's found in that burial and it's found in that location, they say, well, yep, they made it. And there it is.
And what are they saying to some of this evidence, as I'm sure this is just continuing to create momentum?
Well, so it's funny because just the last couple of days I put this video out. We've been working on it for a while. These guys had scanned, and in fact, I'll share you some pictures that nobody else has seen real quick here. This is a pre-dynastic granite vase, and it was scanned. Where's the ATOS? Here we go. So it was scanned in a structured light scanner, which is one of these machines, right? So it's like a robotic arm, and these machines are sophisticated. They get used in the aerospace industry to create precision parts. They run you well and truly upwards of $250,000. Here's an example of this vase being scanned on a structured light scanner there. Now, the results that we came out with are just utterly remarkable. I went to some depth explaining them on the video, and anyone who's interested should check that out. But I expected some pushback because it's actually undeniable data that shows you that the precision that's evident in the manufacturing of this pre-dynastic vase is such that because there's a lot of people out there that are like, hey, you can rub two stones together in a technique called lapping and make it pretty flat. Or, you can take a chisel and a flint chisel and make an inside corner in a piece of granite, and there you go, mystery solved. That's not the way to approach this thing. You have to investigate the ancient artifacts, including the most difficult aspects of their construction. So what we've done here is really set the bar of what that means, and it means that you have to be able to create surfaces of this vase that can be mapped to geometric shapes that have a relative either perpendicularity or parallelism or circularity. Or an axis measurement that is consistent with the other parts of the vase within these thousandths of an inch. And believe me when I say that is not remotely possible by hand. So there are some people out there that have looked at, well, I'm going to make one of these by hand, and a few people have done that, and those sort of experiments are good. But the results are a world of difference apart. You cannot achieve this type of precision by hand. So the implication is something else was going on. This is an advanced artifact that would challenge us to make today, even with our best equipment. It is extremely challenging to make something with the tolerances that are as tight as what's been shown to exist on this vase. And this is more than 5,000 years old. So you cannot do this by hand. So the pushback that I've gotten, long story short, is of course you just get, well, if the vases are fake, or you guys are just making this up, or you're lying.
Jesus.
It's anything. Pushback is generally anything to do other than deal with the data.
Yeah.
So they start to attack you.
Back to the drawing board, guys.
You're like, I'm doing the work that y'all should be doing. You've got, letters behind your name that I don't have. And somehow I'm going deeper into the Egyptian evidence than you are. With all of these vases and things that you guys are diving deeper into and discovering that there's a margin of error that's half the width of a human hair, which is mind boggling. What are you coming out of these experiences? Is it strengthening your theory? Do you have a new theory of what's going on or what happened? Where does this new evidence put you?
Well, I'm personally, it's almost vindicating to see these sort of results, because I have been trying to analyze. It's exactly the type of testing that I've been calling for years now, and not just me, other people too. But for the longest time, I've said we should be applying the best of our modern tools and technology to try and investigate the manufacturing of some of these complex objects. And a lot of my work has really focused on the nature of precision and the obvious signs of things that we can measure and that we can analyze from the outside, barring this type of analysis. So then finally, when we can come to the point where, okay, we've actually got our hands on one of these from a private collection, and we can get it analyzed to this degree, and it turns out that the results are exactly what we thought they might be, which is utterly remarkable and profound and entirely devastating to anybody that says, oh, these were just made with simple sort of Bronze Age tools and tech. Then that's really vindicating. I think it's great. It's exactly the type of thing we should be doing, because in general, Egyptologists and the curators of these museums that have the access, they control the access to these artifacts, have no interest in exploring or investigating the nature of the engineering and manufacturing of these vessels. They don't care. They're more interested about what did I find in it, what's written on it, what's poorly, what are the glyphs that have been poorly scratched into this amazing object say, than ever really investigating how they were made, because it's a real challenge to it. Because you got to remember that, again, this mainstream story of history that these guys are the self-proclaimed experts in, it's a bit of a house of cards, because when you start making discoveries like this, and these discoveries like this vase and the precision it shows has the implications of saying those tools and techniques that you say made these, not possible. Something else is going on. So it's kind of like it's changing some of the foundations of the whole story of saying, well, no, there was no one before the dynastic Egyptians. They made everything with pounding stones and copper chisels. But now you've got evidence that directly contradicts this, and they've been barring the work and barring this investigation, this type of work for decades now. There's been just no interest. You can't get your hands on these objects to do this type of work, and it's taken a private collector who does have a few of these artifacts, and was willing to let them be scanned. Like, that's what it's been taking. So yeah, it's great. Like, it exactly puts us in the right direction, and I hope it stirs up more interest. Like, I hope that whether I'm right or wrong, let's get some of these artifacts. Let's get into the museums. Like, it's completely harmless. It's literally a light scan. It uses structured light. It's not going to hurt it. We can only stand to learn stuff from it. So I think the intention we have is to build up a body of work. If we can get access to more of these vases, more of these objects, we can learn more about their construction and their manufacturing, and draw more conclusions, that show us, what it really took to make some of these things. And the challenge is now out there. After this video, we're going to release the STL file, essentially the CAD file for it, with all of the dimensions down to that level of precision, and put the challenge out there. It's like, who make it? Try and make it even in from steel or aluminum. Mm-hmm. It would be tremendously challenging to make that on a modern 5-axis mill. But if you want to try and hand make it from granite, go for it. Like, let's do it. And because I can guarantee, from my personal opinion, no one's ever going to make anything this precise. It's just not remotely possible. A lot of people seem to think, well, they just sat around for 50 years and did nothing but this type of work. You don't. This half the width of a human hair. By the way, it's not just a surface we're talking about. You're talking about the relative geometry of aspects of the vase. So yeah, it's half the width of a human hair off being perfectly perpendicular or parallel with the top of the vase at the bottom of the vase. Like, maintaining that geometry and understanding the nature of that precision is part of what I tried to convey in the video that I put out about it. Yeah, it's those are the difficult aspects of these artifacts. And we see that also in other artifacts, at least as best as we've been able to measure them. Things like boxes, statues, columns. So it's evidence for a very sophisticated manufacturing system that was capable of producing just remarkable degrees of precision, degrees that we've only been capable of producing ourselves in recent decades, and particularly in industries like aerospace. Like, that's what we're talking about. It's very sophisticated, and the evidence is getting stronger and stronger for it. So yeah, I think it's great. Like, I was so happy when these guys contacted me, and the timing worked out amazingly, because I got to talk about this on Joe Rogan. I sort of introduced it to everyone on Joe Rogan, and then that's driven a lot of interest in this video where I've just put out showing like all the nitty-gritty details of it.
Yeah, you were absolutely dunking. Yeah, you were like grinning ear to ear watching you on Rogan, because it was just like watching Rogan's face and then like your face, like watching him. It was awesome.
Something that was showcased on the trip to Egypt that is supportive of all the things that you're saying. Yusuf, our Egyptian local guide, said it numerous times. Don't ever underestimate the capabilities and the capacity of the dynastic Egyptians. And you're able to see that. You're able to see the craftsmanship of what you're saying. 50 years, 100 years, generational craftsmanship that's been passed on and on. It's fucking insane. It's absolutely incredible. But you're still clearly able to see something as that is human made, with an artistic expression that is incredible and beautiful, but human nonetheless, compared to some of these others.
But full of errors that are larger than a human hair.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, and that's a very good point. And I'm not and you got to admit, yes, the dynastic Egyptians did amazing work. Like that was one of the greatest civilizations to have ever existed. I mean, they built Karnak Temple, that huge soaring, sandstone pylons, the things that are like 60 feet high.
Yeah.
They built all of, and the story of the vases, like after those, like I said, those granite and real hard ones disappeared, but after that, most of the vases are made from alabaster and white calcite, and they're utterly beautiful and they're amazing. It became a high art form. And it's undeniably the work of just master craftsmen that, it's like you have generations of people working at that stuff, but they don't show the same characteristics of precision that the earlier ones do. And the same thing applies to some of the other work. But undeniably, the dynastic Egyptians are such a beautiful thing to go and witness. And, the temple of Seti I and Dendera, these huge temples that are full of glyphs and paintings and color. I mean, that's all dynastic work. And it's remarkable. And it's one of my favorite parts of going there too. Like I'm not discounting what the dynastic Egyptians did, but there is a delta. Like there is this also later on in the civilization, they had access to iron. I mean, they had a lot of these craftsmanships and techniques became high art forms, but there's still this big delta between the precision objects and then what they did. And that's what I tend to focus on. There's still stuff that isn't explainable even by the capabilities that they had even late in their civilization. But it's not, you should not underestimate the capabilities of the dynastic Egyptians, as Yusuf says. Yes.
The other thing, because it's easy to just be like, oh, these assholes in archaeology and academia, like, why aren't they looking at this? And you've done a great job of articulating just how the system works and how tied to their identity they are with the amount of money and structure and years and dedication and
people have built their whole life on teaching these
and
concepts.
legitimate work that's been done. But there's this layer of context that's lost because you and others are looking at some of these things from the perspective of your lanes of genius that maybe an archaeologist wouldn't possess, like the level of engineering that would be required, the level of even just technology at large, your history in IT, being able to clearly see how technological evolution looks on a linear scale and seeing that there are massive discrepancies here. And so while there is dogma like involved, and there's some of these guys probably have egos that are through the ceiling, there is a level of like, well, they're just lacking certain data points of context in order to evaluate these things on at a holistic scale.
Yep. No, it's a great point. You're right. And I don't want to disparage. Like I said, I think there's issues with the science in general, archaeology, Egyptology. There's definitely, and I know Graham Hancock talks about the same thing. Definitely issues with the way that system works. The problem is that I often say this: you wouldn't trust an archaeologist to engineer the chair that he's sitting on. But if it's an ancient chair, he's going to claim ownership and dominion over all aspects of it. That's the issue. I do wish that they would take more seriously the opinions of the actual experts, like engineers, craftsmen, stone carvers and cutters, people that know that are these subject domain experts. And I interview and talk with a lot of guys like that. And that's what I hope is, should be the way forward. And I also don't disagree with a lot of what archaeologists say, like the way we have such a good understanding of dynastic Egypt, like how the civilization worked, its timelines, its rulers, how people live their daily lives, all these things. They're correct. I mean, I don't have any dispute with any of that. It's mostly about what happened before that and how much of that stuff they inherited, right? Because mostly at the end of the day, archaeology is kind of like it's more like it's not really a hard science. It's an interpretation of a very loose and sparse set of evidence. It's not like a hypothesis experiment result that you get in, say, chemistry. You're really piecing together. It's almost like a puzzle that you're putting together, like it's a court case. Yeah. Like it's a trial that's going on, and your job is to present the version of events that you think happened based on the best evidence. And my problem with it mostly is that they stop looking at a lot of the evidence. It's like a court case that never ends. There's more evidence keeps coming up, and some of that evidence is definitely in the engineering realm, or it might be coming from catastrophism, or it might be coming from the ancient maps and the evidence for something sophisticated going on in the past, or the extension of the human timeline. And that stuff just doesn't get factored into when I think it should be. And, I understand why it's happening. to some extent, it's the nature of the discourse is changing. It used to be back in the Victorian era that there was a lot more open-mindedness in Egyptologists because they were just talking with each other in these academic halls. And then, up until the last real century, we started to get these books and alternative independent researchers putting their opinion out there. And now we have the internet. We have punters like me that can get an audience and make a case. And to some extent, I think they see that control of the story and the narrative slipping out of their fingers. So you get a very visceral response.
Yeah.
And also, I think archaeologists, some of them at least, the guys in academia, and I'm sure this applies to not all of them, but some of them, their sense of self-worth and personal power is attached to their position as an expert on a story, which is all it is. History is like this story that you've put together and you're the expert on it. It's kind of like a priest in a religion. If you go up to a priest in a religion and say, well, your God doesn't exist, or, everything you said about them is wrong from a fundamental level, you're probably going to get a strong response. And so there's a little bit of that going on in the discourse today. And it's unfortunate. And I wish there was more open debate and discussion. And I think there's a place for that. I don't necessarily think that place is YouTube and people making YouTube videos about each other. So I don't respond to, like, people make videos about me. I don't respond to it. That's not the place for the debate. I'm just presenting my ideas and putting them out there and putting them forward. But there's absolutely a place for debate and discussion on a lot of this new evidence. And we're trying to foster some of that with the Cosmic Summit. And I know Hancock's organizing a debate for Rogan that's coming up.
Good. We were saying that when we were watching, we were like, if anyone can, get a debate going, it's Rogan. Like, okay, let's invite Ben and Graham and Randall, and then we'll invite 3 of the, mainstream archaeologists. And it's like, let's just have a civil discussion. But to your point, it's not just about the facts and the figures and the stats and it's about the identity. It's about, I have attached my life and livelihood to this story. And if this story is wrong, then much of my life and work in academia has been could be possibly proven to be a sham or be wrong. That's exactly the reaction you get. But and they're very defensive about that story. But I don't think that's, honestly, they're not wrong about things like the civilizations that they study. It's just the basis for where they came from, and what was inherent and what happened before. And it's like they're trying to claim dominion over all of it. And I don't think they'd be treated that way, even if they were to open up and be open about the evidence. Say, you know what, there was probably something else going on before these times. But you're right, and I do have hope though. For the next generation, I've been contacted by a lot of archaeology students and people that are going to be the next generation of the establishment of academia, and I think they're going through college and they're I think they've got no choice but to face some of the questions being raised by guys like Graham Hancock and by this work. I just think, and certainly the messages and the correspondence I've had. There's a lot more open-mindedness. So maybe it's just a case of, the next generation's we're going to get there and we'll be able to embrace some of this in a bit more of an open-minded fashion. But I mean, maybe it'll take the next generation. We'll see. But I don't know. I'm hopeful for the future. I don't think this thing lasts forever. And archaeology is by no means the only scientific field that suffers from this type of embedded dogma, right? It continues to happen.
Yeah. I'm curious, I would imagine so much time and energy is really spent in this sort of brick wall that you keep running into. But beyond that, why is it important that we get into the details of what potentially could be a misled or misrepresented history of humanity? And how important is it for us as, humans in 2023 to look for the real version of where we came from?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. There's obviously the old axiom of people that don't understand the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat them. So there's always an element of that involved in it. But I think it gets to the nature of a few of our fundamental questions as well. It's why are we here? Where did we come from? What's our purpose? I think getting into these details helps to address some of those types of fundamental issues. But I kind of briefly mentioned it up front, but I do think it's important just from the perspective of the general zeitgeist of understanding that our civilization's place in our history. Like, I just think that it's not like something we think about in the front of our brains, but for sure, everyone's been taught. And if you ask someone, where did we come from? Like, what's our part? We have this general understanding that we went from the Stone Age to now, like from the Stone Age to space shuttles to striped toothpaste, whatever, right? From on this more, I mean, it's ups and downs in reality, right? But it's this linear path that goes from 6,000 years ago to now. And I think that just is like, well, it's almost like a preordained path. It's how we got here. It's the natural evolution. I don't have to worry about anything. This is what civilization looks like. Now, I do think that if more people fundamentally understood that it's this cyclical relationship between, cataclysm and civilization, a rise and fall, like this, I call it the cosmic hamster wheel of human civilization. Every so often the hamster falls off. And that could have the effect ultimately of affecting our priorities. Like it's like the movement that you talk about, climate change or whatever, whether you agree with it or not. I mean, it's becoming a pervasive understanding and in the youth and in the next generations, and it's affecting the way that we create policy and treat our environment, and it's having all these implications. This could be something similar in terms of like, we've had advanced civilizations before. They were wiped out because it turns out we live in a cosmic shooting gallery that has all sorts of threats coming at it on long enough time frames, where it's the sun or it's supervolcanoes or it's cosmic impacts or whatever it is. But these things happen, and we're learning they happen more and more frequently. And by the way, it looks like we've actually been here before and been wiped out, knocked back to hunter-gatherers and small populations in the past. And if we want to survive, and if we want to ensure our long-term future, if we're interested in that, then maybe we spend a little less money worrying about the next election cycle and the quarterly results and building tanks to fight with each other.
Yeah.
And maybe we focus a bit more of our energy on working together to spread out, to get into space, to understand the challenges of our cosmic environment and try to conquer them. Now, some of that is starting to happen at a very slow rate. Like, we're paying more attention to nearby space. They've gone out and done the DART mission where they tried to deflect an asteroid. All these are good things, but I just, it's a tiny sliver of a fraction of the budget and the money that we're putting into all these other, I think, ultimately meaningless endeavors. Fighting wars and beating on each other and othering people and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So, and again, like I said, I think it's very altruistic and it's a long-term goal. But if you could change that perception of what it means to be a human civilization, maybe that shifts our priorities. And again, whether you agree with it or not, with things like climate change, we see that happening. Yeah. Like, it's so pervasive now, and it's that future generations, it's a huge part of how they live their lives and of how we treat the environment and how you act. Yeah. So I think it fits into that battle. And for me, me personally, I'm fascinated by it. I'm I'm deeply interested in it. But I think there's the altruistic side of it. That's the long-term goal.
Yeah, I mean, when you stare at something of this magnitude, that is this mysterious. It's like a psychedelic. I mentioned at the start of the show. It's like staring at the top of a mountain over a vast landscape, and you realize perspective, and you realize, man, if having a more broad view of this life experience makes me rethink where I'm putting my time, energy, and resources. And I think that we all get too tunnel visioned and get, too connected to our very, very short sight of what life means and how we dedicate our time, energy, and resources. And something even just our 3 weeks in Egypt did that for me without drugs and just diarrhea, really.
Yeah.
But it really, it's like it helps you orient back into your day-to-day life in a way that's like, what am I really doing with my time?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's fantastic. Like, it scratches some sort of fundamental itch. It certainly does that for me. Like, I love it. Like, it's just, I love getting the chance to go to these places. I have the same experience every time. Like, it's always a new experience for me, that I see something I didn't see before, and it takes you someplace else. You get invigorated by it. It's a great the concept. I think that there's lots of ways to have the effects of a psychedelic experience. There's lots of ways that can impact in your life, and this is I like that description of it. That's what it does. It does change the way your brain is wired for a bit, and then gives you a fresh perspective on everything else. And yeah, that's always important. So
what we talked a lot about Egypt, obviously, because we were just there with you.
Mm-hmm.
What other sites are you looking into? You know, Atlantis is one that gets brought up a lot. And it was relevant in the conversation with Rogan.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just Egypt, right? We've got it happens to be kind of the most mainstream showcase of some of this. But where else are you looking? Where else should people be focusing their attention if they're interested?
Egypt's the best. I mean, Egypt is kind of like the top of the list for a lot of that stuff. And there's nothing quite like the pyramids in Giza or anywhere in the world. But there is tremendous evidence for this, lost civilization being a global presence. You have very consistent megalithic, by megalithic list, these huge cyclopean blocks that are put together with insane precision. You can't stick a razor blade between them. There's lots of evidence for that all around the world, from Lebanon to Easter Island, Turkey. I mean, some of the earliest and oldest civilizations, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. I'm going to Turkey in April for the first time. And awesome. that should have shifted the date of civilization back to like 10,000 years ago. It didn't. The academics just changed the definition of hunter-gatherer. Turns out that's a whole other story. But one of the other best examples to me, like South America, Central America, but in particular South America, Peru, Bolivia, there's just tremendous megalithic works, and it has a strong resemblance and consistency with what you see in Egypt. A lot of the same building techniques, I guess, were used. You have a lot of the same characteristics of walls and structures being made from a single type of stone that's come from a long distance away, and it's put together with this remarkable precision. There's absolutely a similar story in South America of a technological mismatch. It's even more obvious in South America. Like it to me, it's, once you see the difference in the technological levels in South America, it becomes impossible to unsee it. And you have, because in Egypt, you have a civilization that went for 3,000 years. In South America, you're talking about the Inca in general, in Peru, that was roughly 150 years old as a civilization. Very brief time it existed. And they more or less attribute most of everything to them. But there's this chalk and cheese, night and day difference in what you see there. I could show you some pictures even, but it's like very, very primitive little small stones with mud mortar on top of these massive megalithic ruins of these huge, precise granite blocks that have been put together in all these polygonal walls.
Wow.
It's night and day. And you can very obviously see that the Inca were repairing and trying to rebuild a lot of these sites, and they didn't make them. So there's a true lost history in South America. We don't know. There's a huge gap. I think Egypt, the dynastic civilization, you can't disconnect them from what I would call the megalithic builders, whether it's Atlantis or whatever, like the lost civilization. The Egyptians are connected to them. They talk about them in their own history. They stretch their own past back to them. And I think they're connected from. In fact, I think they even get their iconography, their culture, what we would look at and say that's ancient Egyptian, like the statues, all of that. I think a lot of that comes from that original culture. Versus in Peru and places like that, you have a huge gap in time. I think a lot of that stuff there could be just as ancient, pre-cataclysm, but then you have this huge gap in time because South America was devastated by this cataclysm. And I just don't think you've literally got thousands and thousands of years that went by with nobody, until you do get the rise of a relatively primitive culture like the Inca, which was only in the 15 and 1600s, like not even that long ago, 500 years ago.
Yeah.
And they're now finding these abandoned megalithic ruins and rebuilding them. And they exist for about 150 years until the Spanish come along and murder everybody. And that's then our modern civilization gets built on top of that. It's actually a remarkable place. Cusco in the highlands of Peru is one of my favorite cities in the whole world. I think it's one of the most ancient and most unique places you can visit, because you have in the city center there, in the streets, you have megalithic construction, you have Inca construction, you have colonial Spanish, and you have modern, and they're all piled up on top of each other, and you can clearly see the layers.
Wow.
It's amazing. It's I say very unique. It's unique.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable place. But you see the same thing, Easter Island. megalithic builders, the Moai there, right? They're built the big granite statues. They're standing on top of megalithic walls. The Temple of Jupiter at the Baalbek in Lebanon, they attribute it to the Romans, but it's sitting on top of a foundation that's made up of stones that weigh 900 tons. And there's stones in the quarry that weigh like 1,500 tons, well and truly beyond the capability of the Romans. And I think they just built their stuff on top of this pre-existing foundation. There's evidence for some of this stuff in Russia. There's I think a lot of it may well be underwater now. Like, this is the thing. During that cataclysm, the sea levels rose 300 to 400 feet all around the world. So, you've got the Sunda Shelf off Indonesia, which was a huge area of land, thousands, if not millions of square miles of land that was above ground, now is underwater at this point. Antarctica. There's crazy evidence in ancient maps that show you the coastline of Antarctica, and they've been matched very precisely to what's under the ice today. And these maps come from ancient times that are drawn from even more ancient source maps that are now lost to us through the fire of the Library of Alexandria, things like that. There's actually tremendous evidence in some ancient maps that show, we were mapping the Earth, and the Earth looked very different at some point in the past. So
yeah, I know Kirk talks about that a little bit in Apocalypse. When you're entertaining the funnest of theories for how all of this happened, what are some of the ones that you perk up over, and then where do you kind of place your bet at this point?
On what? On just what happened?
Yeah. How did the level of technology? Is it ancient aliens? Is it a version of human that just had different capacities for connecting with intelligence in some way? Like, how did these things get formed? And then maybe we can get into what are they for?
Okay. Well, I mean, it's all speculation, right? I try to be pretty clear about when I'm speculating. So first of all, it's not ancient aliens for me. I don't need aliens to explain this. Now, that's not to say that I don't believe in aliens. I think it's a mathematical certainty that life exists in the universe outside of us. I think there's something to the UFO, UFP phenomenon. Like, what that is, I don't know. Is it black projects? Is it reverse engineered craft that landed in Roswell? Is it actually, visitors from other dimensions or space? I don't know. I think there's something going on.
I definitely learned a lot on our Egypt trip with some of the other guests.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Marty.
You were complete experts. I'm like,
we're sitting at lunch, and every day there's a new theory. Like, okay, listen to this, you guys. Just hear me out.
Yep. Marty's deep into that world.
Yeah.
So look, but I don't need it. And even Bob Lazar on Rogan said one of the craft that they were working on at Area 51 was from an archaeological site. So it's this inference that maybe these were existing back in ancient times, and why not? But I don't think these are, you require alien technology to build this stuff. I just think you need humans and you need technology. And when I say humans too, I am open to the possibility that it wasn't Homo sapien sapien. Like, it might have been, we know that our cousins, if you like, the other hominids had bigger, like Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. Like, there's the Denisovans, there's the Homo floresiensis. We keep finding more complex versions of humans that are extinct now that did once exist. You've got this whole elongated skull phenomenon that happens in South America. I'm not discounting the possibility that it wasn't necessarily us, and maybe that other type of human had other capabilities. Graham Hancock certainly goes down that route and gets it. They throw it in his face all the time. He's purely speculating as well, because he thinks it could be connected to mental powers or something like this. For me, I don't go down that route so much. I think it's explainable by technology. I think it's, in a lot of cases, probably technology that we wouldn't recognize today. It may be technology. Like, I almost look like our civilization, we have a electromechanical approach to problem solving, right? We do everything a certain way. We're very advanced in certain aspects of technology. Now, maybe the speculation could go that the ancient civilization may have evolved down a more organic route. Like, they might have been able to use organic materials. Why they work in stone and not in composite materials. They were able to very easily manipulate stone. However they did that. I think for sure they were able to work in that material in an easier fashion than we can, because they've just done so much in it. Like, and so there's whole other parts of technology that I think are potential answers for what we see, and we should be open-minded to it. It makes it very difficult to like say specifically what it was. If it's that same old saying, right? We don't know what we don't know.
Yep.
But I think some of the answers may lie in that realm. And you mentioned like, what's it for? I am 100% convinced that some of it was functional. Today, all the Egyptologists and archaeologists say everything's ceremonial, everything's representational. It's for religious purposes. It's for ceremonies and all this. I'm very convinced that parts of this were functional, whether it's for energy generation or some other function. I don't know what that is, but I'm convinced it was. In particular, things like the giant boxes. You have these all over the place in Egypt, either underground or in pyramids, these giant single-piece hardstone boxes that display similar aspects of precision that we've talked about earlier. And I think there was something going on with those. And it's a complex sort of point, but there's a definite relationship between precision and function. Like you don't develop the ability to make things that are perfect to within a thousandth of an inch. That's an expensive capability to develop unless you're chasing a functional return.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Like if a box is ceremonial and you got to bury a bull in it, there's no reason to make it perfectly flat and square. I mean, you color within the lines and slap a lid on it is good enough. Like it serves its purpose. You don't have to make it solid. You don't have to get rid of all the cracks. You know, you look at our microprocessor industry today, like we can develop chips with, a density or in a process that's 5 nanometers, in width. Like we're making transistors down to these tiny amounts, incredibly complex technology. But we're doing so because we're chasing a functional return on the power footprint and the efficiency and all these other things. The same thing applies to the nature of ancient precision. And it's applied to the nature of precision in our modern world. Like we only started to develop precision once we wanted our friggin' naval cannons to shoot straighter, and we wanted to make accurate, chronometers so we could keep time. And then the steam engine came along, and oh man, we need flat surfaces for that because more pressure and all this. So you develop that capability for a functional return, and then once you have it, and your manufacturing capability supports it, everything you make now can show you those aspects. So it's why you get to vases and statues that also have this nature level of precision in them. It's hard to argue that a vase or a statue is functional, but it's definitely precise. It's the result of that manufacturing process, in the same way that modern cars today, like the panel gaps and everything's much more precise and tight than it was in the 1960s. Does it have to be? No. But our manufacturing process, that's what you get. You design it and it stamps it out and it makes it, and then it's much more precise than it used to be, thanks to the nature of the manufacturing process. So that's kind of where I go with this stuff. It's not, it's probably not as specific as you're looking for, but that's
that's great.
I'm grateful that you take that approach. Like the amount, I think it's we see it a lot in kind of like the holistic health space or the mushroom space, if you will. You get folks who can potentially muddy the water of what you're trying to achieve or represent by getting quite loose in how you entertain ideas. And so I really respect that about the entire trip and all the content that you put out. It's really single focused and in a way that just layers in legitimacy and even like back to the functionality. You brought this up really to my attention, is like when we were over there, we were in a host of different hallways and tunnels and chambers. But when you go into the pyramids themselves and you're in the tunnels and the chambers, it's completely different. It feels like you are literally crawling through something that is more of like an air vent than it is an actual hallway or ceremonial tunnel.
Yeah, the fact that I think a lot of people, and even Google, my sister was nice enough when I threw out some of these theories, I guess, of like what the function of the pyramids are or could be. She copy and pasted from Google. She was like, no, they're burial sites, they're tombs. And I was like, Okay. Yes, that's what Google says, but here's a lot of evidence that points to another story that's maybe not being told. And so, but yeah, when you're in the pyramids, that compared to the Valley of the Kings, where all the tombs are, certainly not every single one, but where these kings and pharaohs were buried. I mean, it is palatial. It is every inch of the walls is colorful glyphs, fit for a king.
Mm-hmm.
When you're inside the pyramids, underneath, and it's air vent type structures, and it seems a lot more functional, to your point, functional rather than ornamental.
Yeah, it's almost industrial. Like I have that feeling too, walking around inside structures like the Great Pyramid. You do feel kind of like you're in a machine. It doesn't feel like it's meant for human occupation. That's for sure. And it would be a hell of a lot more difficult if we didn't have all of the wooden stairs and rails and handrails and stuff they put in there to move around. You'd find it very challenging to get around in there at all, because they're steep passages. You'd be sliding down them and then trying to like climb up them would be a whole other deal. But yeah, you're right, and that's the thing. There's as much as we say they're tombs, and Google might say they're tombs, and the mainstream guys might say they're tombs, but there's very, very little evidence that they're tombs. Almost none, in fact. No bodies have ever been found in them. No glyphs have been found in them. There's some controversy around a particular glyph in the Great Pyramid. There's one glyph in there that's in the very top of the relieving chambers. We can't get into those. It's very difficult to get up there, but there is a glyph up there that supposedly says Khufu. There's a lot of speculation that was carved by Howard Weiss. It's a long story, but it's very suspect. And I can talk about that for an hour, but put it this way, there's no glyphs in the Great Pyramid, and nor in the other pyramids for that matter, the megalithic ones, that suggest that they're a tomb, that kings' names aren't on them. We know what Old Kingdom tombs look like. There are Old Kingdom tombs at the Giza Plateau, covered in glyphs, covered in edifices and things like that. There's no evidence that they're tombs. It's so strange that that's the prevailing theory when there's just no evidence for it. No bodies, no nothing. And there's almost, in fact, once you get into it too, there's very, very little evidence, scant evidence, that even connects these rulers to these pyramids, like Khufu. There's almost no evidence that even though we say that's Khufu's pyramid, other than this very extremely questionable glyph that's in the relieving chamber, there's like a 3-inch statue of him that they found down in the Valley Temple, nowhere near the Great Pyramid, and that's it. Like there's really no evidence that connects them to it. It's just, he's said to, like, it's just during their civilization they sort of associated him with it, and we just take their word for it. Like the funny thing is we've got tons of evidence, and we showed it on the trip, that Egyptian rulers have a strong tendency, particularly in later periods, that the 19th dynasty, Ramses II, right? How many times did we talk about Ramses II and his son Merenptah? The very strong tendency to claim objects and artifacts for themselves and write their names on them. Like Ramses was notorious for this. He would take something that's far more ancient and carve his name into it, and then therefore later on in history he gets attributed as being the guy who had it made, because that's how Egyptology works. They read what's written on it. If there's writing on an object, they go, okay, well, clearly this object was made by that guy, and maybe the whole site was made by that guy in that period, because we know about when that guy lived. And it's just, there's so many examples of where this stuff's been inherited and rewritten on. There's objects with 3 or 4 pharaohs' names on them. And the same thing could have happened in the Old Kingdom. In fact, there is strong evidence for renovation and inheritance in the Old Kingdom as well. I have some videos on the topic. But, these pharaohs may have even claimed these pyramids for themselves, because there's really bugger all evidence that suggests they had it built. And they certainly don't look like tombs. There's endless contradictions to the tomb theory, but that's what Google will tell you. It's a tomb.
It's funny. I live in a little island off of San Diego, and there's a historic hotel on the beach. It's from the 1800s, and the Hilton runs it now.
Right.
And I'm like laughing to myself, because it's almost like 500 years from now, if it's post next cataclysm, somebody comes to the Coronado Island and they see this structure that's ancient, and they're like, oh wow, this is a Hilton hotel from 2023 or something.
Wow.
And
Right.
it's even older than that. And I think that in many cases is how things have been dated. It's like let's scratch the surface or look at one point that could be, maybe something that is more recent.
Yep.
I've been laughing to myself because as that's probably how it's going to shake out.
Probably. Yeah. Same thing. It's equivalent to like you say, post cataclysm, they go to they find a skyscraper and there's some graffiti written on it. It says, little Timmy was here. And they're like, man, this little Timmy was some dude. He,
right.
He had this thing built. Amazing. It's literally, that is the process that happens on some of these sites. And you see it. The Serapeum's probably the best example with the giant, big precision granite box that's got like literally chicken scratch writing all over it.
Oh,
you can see someone's just attacked this thing with a chisel very poorly. No straight lines. They couldn't even mark the surface in places, but it's the most valuable box because it's got the most writing on it and it tells us the story of who built this place. It's like, you can see your reflection in the quality of this.
Oh. It's a 100 ton?
100 ton, more or less. Yeah, I mean, about 70,
box.
80 tons the box and 30 tons for the
and like perfect 90-degree angles on the inside and outside. And then, like you said, it's like chicken scratch glyphs. It looks like, honestly, like something I could do. Like if they were like, okay, copy this, I'd be like, okay, I'll do my best.
You can literally see the marks from where someone's attacked it with a chisel. And the box itself has perfect straight lines and there's not a single straight line in the writing. It's waving all over the place. The granite's been polished to a mirror finish, which is not a natural property of granite. You have to work really hard to do that. Yeah, there's a huge technological mismatch across Egypt. It's one of the other signs of inheritance and reuse. There's a massive difference between the quality of the writing, even the good writing, and the objects themselves. Like even the good writing became a high art form too. Like it's not all chicken scratch like the Serapeum box. There's also excellent writing, but you look closely at it. It's still done with hand tools. You can achieve it with hand tools. And like I said, later in that civilization, they did have iron and steel. So you're much more effective about carving granite, but it doesn't display the same characteristics, things like the machining marks and the precision that you see on some of the artifacts. It's why I actually think, and Yusuf thinks this as well, is that the writing is all done by the dynastic civilization. I think they, like obelisks and things like that, I think they added writing to them. Statues, they added the writing. And we showed there's a lot of examples of where it's obvious that the writing came later. Like it's in some places, like on the big statues, you have glyphs that are carved over features that were pre-existing on the statue. So it's like the belt line and the dagger and the kilt. Yeah. You can literally see the marks where they've carved over the top of that stuff. Now, if you were making that statue from scratch and designing it with the intent of having that writing as a part of it, you wouldn't go to the effort of carving granite and carving these features into granite only to have them basically written over the top of. You would incorporate that glyph somewhere else in another way, in a feature that was a bit more holistic. I mean, you just wouldn't do it that way. And there's almost an endless series of examples just like that. Yet that writing and that glyph is exactly how that object gets dated and related into the story of history. It's funny. The whole thing is, a lot of these assumptions that we make about these artifacts you dig into the details and you can really challenge them. I think.
Yeah, it's making me think of, all of these details and these stories and the new evidence and everything, like pointing to the fact that, like, okay, kids, listeners, us, everyone, the history books, just because they're printed, don't have all the answers. Just because you find it on Google doesn't mean there's not a wealth of evidence that would point to a different, another story. And all of that to say, this doesn't just apply to archaeology, Egyptology, history. That's kind of a sentiment that I hope we carry throughout life, where it's like, if we think we have all the answers in science, in health, in spirituality, in Egyptology, we're fooling ourselves. Let's not be so arrogant that we stop asking questions and that we stop questioning our beliefs that maybe we've held for a very long time. I think that it gets into dangerous territory, kind of the too big for our britches type of deal when we think that we do have all the answers. And I just love this idea of, like, let's just stay humble and keep the question marks coming. Like, just well, we won't use any periods. We'll just use question marks on the ends of any types of, presentations of these evidences, and, how you present what you've discovered and everything. It's like, you're not claiming to have all the answers either. And
no, I don't.
Another thing that I love, it's also frustrating at times because I'm like, Ben, I want the answer.
Yeah, I get that a bit. Yeah, I don't have the answers, people. I definitely don't have the answers, but I'm trying to. What I want us to do is to look for them in a more open-minded fashion. Yeah, that's exactly what you said is exactly right. It's always worth returning to first principles and to question our beliefs. It's always worth questioning authority and whatever the mainstream is that tell you that it's true because it's true. Like, that's worth questioning.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm not claiming to know how this stuff was done. I'm pretty confident. I know some of the claims that say they know how it was done are wrong, which is sort of the basis for a lot of my questions and work. And I'm hopeful that we will go and look for the answers in a bit more of an open-minded fashion. And yeah, I echo. I'm a little concerned about the way that information gets controlled a little bit in the modern era, just because, it's not just the internet anymore. Now, the internet is essentially a series of portals that we all look through to whether that's a Google search result or it's Wikipedia or it's Facebook or it's a social media engine. I mean, those are control points that are pretty much trying to dictate and control information. You see it on YouTube, you see it on Google, you see it on Twitter and social media, where it's like, oh no, this information's incorrect, this can't be right. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of efforts being made to control that information. And yeah, I mean, don't even get me started on Wikipedia and some of these, not just Google, but Wikipedia's got its issues too when it comes to some of these contentious topics.
I refuse to use Wikipedia because I have heard from too many experts, doctors, people like Graham Hancock, who are completely 100% misrepresented on Wikipedia. Oh, yeah. So this is the PSA, like, everyone stop using Wikipedia, because there's only a certain amount of people that can edit, and then it can never be changed by the person who actually knows what's actually going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I called out a guy, I won't mention the name, but it was a mainstream archaeologist for calling everybody else's opinion biased and pointing them towards the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis page on Wikipedia and saying this is the most unbiased source for it, which was, of course, entirely in line with his perspective that it was all a bunch of nonsense and recycled comet myths, which it's not. There's more than 150 peer-reviewed papers behind it, but turned out he was the one editing the Wikipedia page and saying that. Like, it's just, and I called him out for it and he blocks me. This is years ago now. But yeah, that's kind of how that works. That's right. There's a whole tribe of people and a caste system almost behind who can edit Wikipedia pages and what it says. It's by no means an authoritative source. Yeah.
Well, man, this has been so awesome. I know there's still more to be desired, and I want to leave more to be desired, because the goodie bag that is your YouTube channel includes so much more, and things that blew my mind when we were in Egypt, and what you've articulated over the years. Tube drill marks, some of the work around even just like newer technologies that are coming out that we might be able to start drawing some lines of conclusion or correlation to, as it pertains to some of these, ancient technologies, which I think there's more to come. But where is there anything else that's just like wildly compelling that you're dying to share, and or what are you currently working on that people can start paying attention to?
I would, I mean, I do have I'd say this, if you're new to the topic, I do have an introduction video that kind of lays out the overall case. Might be worth going and taking a look at that. And I do have a whole series on, I guess, the nature of the evidence for ancient technology, like precision machining. Like, I've got some sort of ground level things, and then we dive into sites. I've been fascinated recently by some of the giant statues, the 1,000-ton plus objects. There's evidence for a whole bunch of those, and we've been finding some more evidence for those. So some of my recent content's on that. But lately, I'm really down with the vase work. Like, I think that the vases represent a true smoking gun to the mainstream story, because they disappear. Because, like, you can argue all day about statues and columns, and you get people to say, no, they made it later on because it's on a site from the New Kingdom or whatever. And I think a lot of that stuff, is more ancient. You can't make that case with the vases. The vases are significantly advanced technological object that then disappear from the very earliest times of the Egyptian kingdom, like 3rd, 4th dynasty, gone. They're with very few exceptions after that. They're all alabaster and different stone, different technology. So the vase work and the fact that we've managed to get one scanned, I think it's a world's first. I think it is genuinely moving this discussion forward. I hope it. There's definitely been some gnashing of teeth and some backlash from some mainstream sources, which I was entirely expecting. But I very much hope some people take us up on the challenge of trying to make them, and that we can get access to a few more of these things and build up a body of work. So I'm pretty intently focused on that at the moment. Also preparing for, I've got a bunch of trips coming up, and then the Cosmic Summit. I think that's going to be great. Like I want to share, and I'm going to present the overall case, like I think a version of what you saw in Egypt, but then dive in. I want to really, because it's only 45 minutes or something, I'm really going to focus on the vases and the recent scanning work and try and convey what where we're at with that and what it means for the story of history. But yeah, I'm getting to a couple of places that I haven't been to for the ever this year. So Turkey, the UK, well, like Stonehenge, all of those sites is all happening this year. So I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah.
Amazing.
Awesome.
And if there's more trips, UnchartedX trips in the future, obviously let us know because we might want to go.
For sure.
But let us know as well, because we'll push it out to our community. As I'm sure you're whetting the appetite of many here.
There were quite a few people when we were in Egypt, and I was doing every day trying to keep up with like, here's what we saw today. And it was a lot, but there were a lot of people that, oh my gosh, Egypt has been on my list. What group did you go with? Who can I contact? How can I do this? So there's definitely a demand for it, at least, even just from our audience, for sure.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I love the Egypt trip. Like I'm going to try and at least, I mean, my next trip's probably going to be January, February of 24. In fact, when we're trying to book out the whole boat, if we can, it'd be about the same size group. But if we do that, imagine the boat, but we'll be on the boat for like 11 days instead of just the 3 or 4, which would be great. And then, we'll see. But I love that. And I genuinely enjoy sharing these things with people on those trips, and people definitely seem to have the time of their lives on these trips. I get that feedback quite a bit. So yeah, it's worth doing. It's worth doing it with a good group. Those will be posted. I mean, I post everything up I'm doing on my website. It's unchartedx.com, upcoming tours and stuff like that. And then my socials are all there, and I tend to message those out when the trips are ready and things like that. But yeah, I love doing those trips, and I'm going to try and do one a year. Maybe it won't always be one a year, but it's a great opportunity for me to do research. The main thing, we talked about getting the Sphinx Temple. I tend to build them around special permissions and getting into places that I couldn't get into otherwise, and they're very expensive, and I can't afford it. So it's a nice way. You have a group, you share the cost, and then everybody gets to have that experience of going somewhere special, and I get the chance to kind of do a bit of research. So it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah. That was great. The special permissions. Honestly, we felt like VIP.
Well, and I just I get so much dopamine off of telling people that we got special access to places here in the States. Like, I feel like a stud. Like, oh yeah, it's been decades since people have seen this. And,
we're coming in the huge tour bus, and there's people that
get out of the way.
They're waving like we're some kind of movie stars or something. Like, oh no, we're going down into the Sphinx enclosure. Don't worry about it.
There's people just lining the walls around the outside.
Right.
We are down here and you are up there.
And I will just say too, if you're interested in the Egypt trip, definitely follow Ben, follow UnchartedX. It sounds like you'll be keeping that updated. But we came back from that trip and we were like, this was an absolute steal. Like it's not a small amount of money, but it with everything that we did. The hotels that we stayed at, the accommodations, meals being taken care of, guides being taken care of, special permissions, cruise boat, like the people that you meet, the connections that you make, the memory, like we came out of it. We were like, that was not enough money.
Honestly,
I appreciate that.
I'm saying feedback
thank you.
The listener, like, holy crap. It was, we felt like it was a steal.
Yeah, I can tell you, we do it. There's certainly cheaper ways to see Egypt, but you won't get the experience that our guys. And I have to give credit to like Mo and Select Egypt and Yusuf and the Kemet School, because they just put on just a cracker. I genuinely think they're the best in the business at it, because we stay. It's all 5-star. The hotels are just wonderful. The experience is great, and we just pile it on. Like, those guys do impressive work, and I'm lucky that I've connected with them to execute on them, because I just think they're great. Like, everyone, it's a good experience, and it's a fun trip. We try to make. I mean, we understand it's a bucket list item for people in this case, right? Going there, so you want it to be a memorable experience, and I think those guys really deliver doing that. I put the itinerary together, but they're responsible for delivering kind of all of that, which is I think they do an excellent job of. So
you guys
thank you for the vote of confidence.
It's an absolute. You guys are the dream team, really. Like, it's an absolute wild success, and 12 out of 10 recommend it to anyone who's interested.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
Cheers. Ben, thank you so much, man. This was a blast, and I hope it's just a sliver of what's more to come, and if you're doing Peru later, we might jump in there. But just so appreciate your time, your intelligence, and just the level of integrity you put into the things that you're doing. It's just refreshing, and continue to let us know how we can just be an extension of you.
Awesome. Chase, Mimi, fantastic catching up with you guys, and thank you so much for inviting me on here. It was a real pleasure chatting with you. We'll do that.
Yeah, it was so fun. Thank you guys for tuning in and hanging with us. I hope you got your minds blown. Ours were blown all over again. And check out UnchartedX, follow him, stay up on his stuff. Think about going to Egypt. It's absolutely worth it. We'll talk to you next time. Go spread some light. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed that, check out right over here for some more fun clips.
Oh, and you're going to want to subscribe.
Bye.